Hi everybody, and I'm glad I was able to be here on time. I had told Rabbi Poston that I was at a chasna, and I told him I might be as late as 9 o'clock. Amazingly, the chasna was only around 15 or 20 minutes late, which I assumed would be an hour late. That's like standard Israeli time, and therefore I was able to get here a little early. Anyway, welcome to everybody who's come, and I want to announce, as is usually the case, we have a number of dedications. The shir tonight should be for the elevation of the Neshamot of Binyamin, Yisroel, ben Shlomo HaLevy, again a young man that we were davening for more than a year, and tragically he did die, but we hope that our Torah should be a zechus for him. For Tzvia bas Dovid, and Zev ben Shulam, who is the grandfather of Chasya Zahavi. And again, may all of these Neshamos be elevated in Gan Eden in the merit of their generous support of Torah. In addition, we are praying and dedicating the shir for a Refuah Shelemah to Yechezkil Avroham ben Esther, and really all of those who are afflicted, who are ill with COVID or not with COVID, inoculated, uninoculated. May they have the blessings of Refuah Shelemah, and may all of those who are healthy remain healthy, and to Bezrat Hashem, may all of the world progress towards Refuah. Of course, when we say Refuah in Judaism, we always say Refuah ta-nefesh u-Refuah ta-guf, because healing is not only physically healthy, although that is a component of it, but we want to have a healthy soul, a soul that is connected to God, a soul that connects to people, a soul that is filled with Avat Hashem, Avat Torah, Avat Yisroel, and really Avat Habriot, like Aaron HaKohen, who was the Oev Shalom V'Rodev Shalom, the pursuer of peace, the lover of peace. So Refuah is a very, very broad idea that is not limited to physical health. I'm going to start the Parsha today with something a little wild and a little unusual. Little wacky, well, shouldn't I say that's a little irreverent, but it's a passage from the Zohar that's quite fascinating, and it certainly takes the verses out of context, but it does bring out some interesting aspects that are even halachic aspects as well. So it's just such an interesting Zohar that I want to share it with you. In last week's Parsha, we of course read about the marriage of Yitzhak to Rivka. And Yitzhak was 40 years old. Now it doesn't say how old Rivka was. According to some rabbinic traditions, Rivka was only 3 years old. And according to other rabbinic traditions, she was 14. Either way, there was a tremendous age difference between them. And they were married for 20 years. So Yitzhak is now 60. And there were no children. And the pasuk says that Yitzhak prayed that Rivka should have a child, and Rivka prayed. And the pasuk says that God answered the prayer of Yitzchak. So Rashi raises from Chazal a very interesting question. If both Yitzchak and Rivka are praying, why does the Torah say that God answered the prayers of Yitzchak? I mean, God should have answered the prayers of Rivka. So the Talmud says a very interesting answer, that the prayer of Yitzchak was the prayer of a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik. The prayer of Avroham, in other words, the prayer of Rivka was the prayer of a righteous woman who was the son of who was the daughter of a Rasha. So the prayer of a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, has more power than the prayer of a righteous person who is the child of a Rasha, because Yitzchak has Avraham's merit. This is a statement in Chazal that Rashi brings. So the question people ask is, gee, I would have thought that maybe the opposite should be the case. Because if you're a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, so you were raised to be righteous. It was not a sacrifice, it was not a break, it was not a difficulty for you. But Rivka, who came from a house of idolatry, a house of paganism, and embraced Hashem and served Hashem, that's a greater accomplishment. It's similar to what Chazal say elsewhere, that the place where the Baal Tshuva stands, the penitent stands, is higher and greater than the righteous person who never sinned. Because the penitent had lived a life in which they enjoyed all of those forbidden pleasures. And they broke away, and that took sacrifice. So the question is, why would it be the case that the prayer of a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, should be greater than the prayer of a tzaddiket, the daughter of a rasha, or a tzaddik, the daughter of the son of a rasha, whichever it would be? So there's a very, very interesting insight from one of the great Baalei Musar. We know that the founder of the so-called Musar movement, which concentrates on ethical behavior and moral development, was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who died around 150 years ago. And he had many, many disciples. And perhaps the greatest of his disciples was Rav Simcha Zissel of Kelm. Kelm was his city. He's often called affectionately in Yiddish, the Alter of Kelm, the old man of Kelm. And he was an extraordinary educator, pedagogue. In fact, I could give a whole talk about the Alter of Kelm. He had a very, very interesting, in fact, I can't help myself. When I come up with his name, I got to talk a little bit about him. His big thing in Kelm was the inner discipline of never allowing yourself to be distracted off your course. And what he was trying to teach was calmness, not to get excited, not to get agitated, to be calm no matter what emergency faced you. And this was his thing. His main foundation in the service of God was to cultivate a sense of serenity and calmness. In fact, he had all sorts of exercises. To give you an example. After a fast in his yeshiva, the food that was served was fish with a lot of little bones in it. What's the point? Because after a fast, we're hungry, so we tend to eat ravenously. We tend to stuff ourselves. But that's like an animal. He wanted to force people to take their time chewing and eating, even when they are very, very hungry. And he did this by having a lot of bones in the fish, so you can't eat it quickly, etc. These were exercises that he had. Other exercises, and these were actually young boys. His students were not old. His students were like high school age. Essentially, his yeshiva was a high school, more or less. That when you got a food package from home, you couldn't open it up for 24 hours. You don't just rip something open. Take your time. They tell a story about Kelm that one time it was a day of Kriyas HaTorah, and it looked like there was no Kohen there, so they were going to call up a Levi or call up a Yisroel. And then one of the boys noticed that a Kohen just walked in, so he went to the Gabbai and said, "A Kohen walked in?" So the Gabbai said, "Thank you very much for telling us. You have to pay the yeshiva 5 rubles. What's going on? Because on one hand, you gave us good news. On the other hand, why are you looking around and davening who comes in? You're not supposed to be looking around all the time." So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, who later became one of the great Gedolei Hador, he spent like 6 months in the Kelm environment, but he really didn't like it. It was too regimented for him. So he once said later, he says, every person should spend 6 months in Kelm, but then he added, but no more. It was too overly regimented in that way. But that's what the Alter of Kelm, the Alter of Kelm's whole idea was, to be calm, to be deliberate. Don't rush. Don't get agitated. Don't have anxiety. There's enough time to do everything if you don't rush. In fact, that's a saying I think in military surgeons have. When they have to do surgery under very difficult combat conditions, I think there's a saying how long does it take to repair an artery? It'll take 2 minutes if you don't rush. If you rush, you're going to mess up, and it may take a lot longer, and maybe you won't be able to save the person at all. Right, so that's Kelm. Again, it's so interesting because Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had different students who emphasized different things. The Alter of Kelm emphasized calmness, serenity, and order. The Alter of Navardik, another Alter, old man of Navardik, was kind of wild. He would do crazy things. Lock himself in a house for 2 years just to concentrate on serving God, and then starting 150 yeshivos in a few months. Kind of the opposite of order. Just the notion of emunah, and do what you have to do no matter what. The Alter of Slobodka, who founded the great yeshiva of Slobodka, emphasized the greatness of man. Instead of the musar that puts you down, this was the musar that said how great and noble you are. In other words, the motivator of his shita of musar was not, you're so bad, why don't you become better? But rather, you're so great, why don't you live up to your potential? That's called gadlus ha'adam. So each of the students took a different aspect. In fact, that's the sign, by the way, of a very gifted Rebbe, a very gifted teacher, is that each of their students develops in a different way. They're not cookie cutters. The Alter of Kelm was different than the Alter of Slobodka. The Alter of Slobodka was different than the Alter of Novardik. And there were many, many others as well. Some emphasized yira, fear of God. And some emphasized love of God. Different aspects. Some emphasized regimentation. And some emphasized freedom and creativity. And they produced different students because different students needed different types of inspiration and different types of teachers. So be it as it may, that's a little introduction just so you get a sense of these personalities. In fact, maybe one day, we'll have a shir or have a class on these different types of personalities within the Musar movements that are so fascinating. But be it as it may, going back to my original question, this was a little digression. And the Alter of Kelm asked the question that I asked, and that is, why would the prayer of a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, be greater than the prayer of a tzaddikis, the daughter of a Rasha? Lehepech, Rivka's accomplishment seems to be greater than Yitzchak's. So says the Alter of Kelm the following. He says, Rivka's accomplishment was, of course, phenomenally great, especially as a young girl, that she was able to reject the idolatry and paganism and immorality of her family and embrace holiness. But in a sense, once she knew that she was not living in the right environment, then she had to become, in other words, she had no choice in a sense. The fact that she came to that choice is a great accomplishment, but she knew she had to turn her back on it. With Yitzhak, it's exactly the opposite. Yitzchak had the greatest parents that any human being could have. He had an Avroham. He had a Sarah. And it would have been very easy for Yitzchak to imitate his parents. But the Alter of Kelm says the meaning of a tzaddik ben tzaddik means that even though you're a son of a tzaddik, you don't simply imitate what your father does, but you become a tzaddik in your own individualistic and unique way. We know, for example, that Avroham embodies the service of God through loving kindness. And Yitzchak embodies the service of God through inner strength and discipline. Yitzchak didn't just become another Avroham. Yitzchak forged his own unique path. Rivka also forged her own unique path. But for Rivka, forging her unique path was easier than for Yitzchak, because Rivka knew she had no role models. Yitzchak, who did have a role model, and nonetheless forged his own individualistic path, that's a greater spiritual accomplishment. That's what it means to be a tzaddik in your own right, even though you're son of a tzaddik, is a greater accomplishment than to be a tzaddik, the son of a Rasha. Because the tzaddik, the son of a Rasha, knows they have to be their own person. The tzaddik, the son of the tzaddik, doesn't automatically realize that. Which means part of what's going on here is the notion that no matter how great your family is, no matter how great your parents are, you got to be your own person too. You have to forge your own individual identity with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You don't just coast. You don't just imitate. You have to become an innovator in your own relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the greatness, the Alter of Kelm says, with Tzaddik ben Tzaddik. And that actually ties in to his own experience as a Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was the greatest person you could imagine. And yet each of his students pursued a different derech, a different approach, a different way of developing ethical character and the like. This is called the Musar movement. And the way it was originally envisioned, people, a lot of yeshivas even today have Musar. They study Musar. But that just means like for a half an hour or 15 minutes, they look at a book that deals with ethical character, like Mesilas Yesharim. And so people say, oh, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's vision triumphed. And he won, even though there was a lot of opposition at the time. But the truth of the matter is, I have to say, and I hate to say it, that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter absolutely did not win. That essentially his vision is virtually not carried out at all, except in some very, very isolated areas. His point was not to simply learn a book for 15 minutes a day. His point was to have a whole structured program of working on character in which you'd meet in groups, in which we would analyze. In other words, we would sit together and we would talk about the struggles that we have, and we would come up with actual situations that we faced. This week I lost my temper, I got angry. And we would talk about how to work on anger. So these are called, now, there are, Baruch Hashem, in Israel and other places, small groups that get together that actually still do this. They're called Musar Vads. And I would actually suggest you Google the words Musar, Mussar, Vad, second word, Vaad. You'll come up with information. They have these for men and for women. And this is a structured program to work on serenity, to work on anger, to work on generosity, to work on benevolence. And base it on Torah sources, but not just learn books, but to develop practical strategies for how to become a better person. Now, I will admit, I am not a member of a Musar Vad right now, but I am very, very intrigued with this revival of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's real vision, as opposed to the kind of fake vision of a Musar Seder in yeshiva, which is just, they say, just 15 minutes or at most a half an hour a day, and half the yeshiva students learn something else anyway. They'll learn halacha, or they'll learn mishnayos, or whatever it is. I mean, I remember, I was a yeshiva student myself, and it was a commonplace not to pay attention to Musar Seder. So the Musar Vad is a phenomenal idea. And it's even been taken over by people who are not Orthodox. There's even non-Orthodox Musar Vads. Now, again, I'm not in favor of being non-Orthodox. But the point is, if any group of people are working on trying to become better people, it is a good thing. It is a good thing to kind of work on ourselves. So that's a little, all right. Now, now that's not the crazy thing I said I was going to talk about, but I want to share with you a Zohar on those verses that, I should never describe anything in the Zohar as crazy, but it really is something that kind of blows your mind in terms of extreme symbolic interpretation. On the Pasuk says, and behold, Yitzchak was 40 years old when he married Rivka, the daughter of Besuel the Arami from Syria, right, from Aram. So here's what the Zohar says. The term Yitzchak is a remez to the spiritual, ethereal nature of our Neshama. Because Yitzchak was almost not human. Yitzchak, because he was a korban, was godly in a sense. And Rivka is a symbol of the physical body. So when it says Yitzhak was 40 when he married Rivka, that's a remez that 40 years after the coming of Mashiach, the spiritual soul will be reunited in the physical body. Yitzhak marries Rivka, Techiyas HaMesim. Now then it says, and this is really enigmatic, and Rivka is the daughter of Besuel, Arami. Besuel is a name that we give to the luz bone, from which comes the resurrection of the dead. And that luz bone goes by the name Besuel Arami, I'll go over this in a moment. And the letters of Arami can be rearranged to spell Ramai, Besuel, the deceitful one. Now, what is the luz bone? We know some things about the luz bone from the Gemara itself. The luz bone is the small vertebrae at the very base of the spine. We have 18 vertebrae, and the luz bone at the end, like the tailbone, is the 19th vertebrae. And according to Chazal's tradition, that is the one bone of the body that never disintegrates no matter how long it takes. And in fact, it even calls it indestructible. You can pound it with a hammer, you can put it in a fire. It never gets destroyed. And even if the whole body decomposes, the luz bone is still going to be there, and that will be the bone from which there will be resurrection of the dead. So the reason why Rivka is called the daughter of Besuel is because if Rivka symbolically means the body, this body that's going to be resurrected will be the daughter of Besuel. It'll come from the luz bone that is called Besuel, the deceiver. Now, why does it have that name is going to be a little strange. Now, the Gemara tells us a further teaching, that the luz bone gets no nutrition from any of the food that we eat. So all the food that I eat nourishes my blood and my cells, my bones, but the luz bone, so to speak, gets no nutrition from any food that you eat except for the food that you eat at the Malava Malka, which is the festive meal that one is supposed to have when Shabbos is over and you're escorting the queen. And the luz bone gets its nutrition from that, and that's why we say if you want to have a healthy luz bone for resurrection of the dead, one should have the Seudah of Malava Malka. Now, why is the luz bone called Besuel, the Arami, which is Besuel the deceiver? Because the luz bone deceives, because it looks like it's eating and it looks like it dies when the body dies, but it actually remains alive. So this is a wild explanation that is not rooted at all in the simple meaning of the verse, but the Zohar says that the luz bone is called a deceiver because it makes believe that it eats, so to speak, but it does not eat, and that is what will produce the Rivka, which is the body, which is resurrected with the spirit of Yitzhak, which is the Neshamot, going into the body. Now, Rav Yaakov Emden explains the following idea. Why is the luz bone so indestructible? Why is the luz bone the bone from which there will come resurrection of the dead? So Rav Yaakov Emden says a tremendous thought. He says like this. Man was originally, Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava were originally intended to live forever. Why did death come into the world? Only because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas. When they ate the forbidden fruit, spiritually, that poisoned all of their limbs. They were no longer worthy of eternal life. But the luz bone didn't get any benefit from the forbidden fruit, because the luz bone only benefits from what you eat Motzei Shabbos, and this was eaten Erev Shabbos. So the luz bone is indestructible precisely because it never got any benefit from the Eitz Hadas, and therefore death never permeated the luz bone as it permeated all the other limbs of the body. So these two ideas are connected. The fact that it only eats the Motzei Shabbos food is the reason why it is in fact indestructible, because it never was tainted by the death that resulted from the chait of the Eitz Hadas. Okay, so this is just the Zohar. Again, there's no particular, it's not really what the Parsha is talking about, but it's illustrative of the amazing depths of meaning that can be found beneath the surface in Kabbalah, and perhaps it should also remind us of the importance of the Sudas Malava Malka. It doesn't mean you have to make a gigantic meal. Most of the time, that's not, after Shabbos, we tend not to be that hungry. But even if one eats l'chatchila, one should actually wash and have a piece of bread But if one has a piece of cake, that would be good as well, assuming you are allowed to eat cake. Okay. Otherwise, you got to make do with something else. Okay. Alrighty. So now, though, let me go back into maybe a more mainstream type of understanding. One of the most difficult. The Parsha really begins. Yaakov does two things. He cheats Esav twice in this Parsha. His twin brother Esav. One at the age of 15, and the other at the age of 63. Although the Torah does not give you the ages, but if you figure out the calculation, when they're 15 years old. Esav comes in, right? Yaakov and Esav are two different personalities, even though they're twins. Esav is a hunter. Esav is an activist. Esav physically is ruddy and hairy. And Yaakov is smooth. One could imagine his skin is very light. And he sits in the tent. Now, Chazal understand that sitting in the tent means he studies Torah all day. Yaakov is studious. Yaakov is righteous. Yaakov is good. Esav is not necessarily described as evil. We're so used to looking at Esav as evil. That's not the description the Torah gives him. The Torah does not describe Esav as evil. That's kind of what is superimposed on him. But Esav is described as a man of the field and a hunter, and Yaakov is described as the dweller of the tent. And in story number 1, Esav comes in off the field, and he's hungry and he's starving. And Yaakov is cooking a lentil stew, a red stew, cholent, par of cholent. And Esav comes in and says, "I'm starving, give it to me or I'll die." Now what's going on here? Why is Yaakov cooking a lentil stew? So Chazal say that Yaakov was preparing food to give to his father, who was sitting in mourning over the death of Avroham. That's how I know. How did I know that Yaakov is 15? Because let's figure this out. Avroham died at the age of 175. We know that. We know that Yaakov and Esav were born when Yitzhak was 60. We know that. So, if Yitzhak was 60, Avroham was 160, because Avroham was 100 when Yitzhak was born. So, if Avroham died at 175, Yitzhak was 75. If Yitzhak was 75, Yaakov and Esav, who were twins, were 15. That's how I know they were 15, because Avroham died. Now Chazal, to me I always find this extraordinarily touching, because Chazal say Esav did not publicly become a Rasha until the day Avroham died. Then Esav started doing all sorts of things, murdering and raping, all sorts of things. And I think there's a certain implication here, because let's imagine the situation. Yitzhak is not only righteous, but Yitzhak has a certain otherworldly life. That's why Rivka is in awe of him, right? Unlike Sarah, Sarah talks to Avram directly. When Sarah has a problem with the kids, Sarah confronts Avram. Rivka has to make strategies and plans. There is a sense, the Netziv says, that Rivka herself is in awe of Yitzhak. Part of it might be the age difference, and part of it might be that Yitzhak is otherworldly. Yitzhak experienced being a sacrifice of God. Yitzhak is a paradigm of holiness that's different than Avram. Avram had a holiness, I might say, that was more earthy, more involved with people. Yitzhak was mesulak from the world. So Yitzhak has two sons. How does Yitzhak relate to a kid like Esav? Esav doesn't learn. Esav is a bum. Esav's a bum. Even if all he did was play basketball, he's a bum. So what kept Esav in the fold for 15 years? It was a loving grandparent. As long as Avram was alive, Esav had somebody who understood him. This is my reading. I don't really see a source. The only source I have is that Chazal do say Esav did not become a Rasha till the day Avroham died. Based on that source, it seems logical to me, because I see this in real life all the time, where a child is not always understood by his parents, but he could turn to his grandparents for support. Avroham understood that even a kid who plays basketball doesn't have to be a bad kid. And Avroham understood Esav. In fact, after this year, you're going to feel sorry for Esav. Esav becomes a compassionate figure in some ways, a tragic figure, a sad figure. And this will become even more evident as we go on. So Esav kind of loses his grandfather, loses the only person, of course Sarah's already gone, loses the only person who ever really understood him. Now, Rivka kind of doesn't like him, and Yitzhak doesn't understand him. We'll see, Yitzhak actually did like him, but Yitzhak didn't understand him. It's not a kid Yitzhak can relate to. But Avram could relate to him. And he lost his only support. So Esav becomes a Rasha, and he says to Yaakov, Yaakov buys, so to speak, the birthright, which is a spiritual heritage, for a pot of beans. And Esav says, behold, I'm going to die. Why do I need this birthright? And this doesn't just mean I'm so hungry I'm going to die. He's basically saying, after I die, there's no life, there's no olam haba. So what's the point? Who needs the spiritual stuff? Eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow, we will die. So Yaakov takes advantage of this. Yaakov sees that Esav doesn't care. And Yaakov purchases the spiritual heritage. Now let's analyze that. You could say, well, is Yaakov taking advantage of a starving person? You could look at it that way. Or you could say that Yaakov is totally justified. If there's this spiritual gift that the person that has it just doesn't care about it, then why shouldn't it go to the person to whom it makes a difference? Esav made that decision. They tell the story. I'll tell you a little story about this. They tell the story about a man who needed money. He was very, very poor. And he went into a tavern just to see if he could find somebody to sell something to. And they see this Jew. And the Jew, they make fun of him and they say, what are you here for? He says, well, I have a little bit of money, and I was told to buy the first thing that anybody would sell to me. That's what my Rebbe told me to do. So they started joking with him, and one of the men said, I'll sell you my olam haba, and I'll take the money that you have. Okay? So even though you really can't sell your olam haba, but the rabbi told the chassid, buy the first thing that you're offered. So they draw up a document. They saw a joke. They said, I hereby sell you my olam haba in exchange for 1 ruble. Okay. And everyone's laughing that the guy has a ruble, etc. So then what happens is, when the guy who sold his olam haba comes home, he tells his wife, you should know what happened today in the bar. There was this idiot, simpleton Jew who was told that he should buy the first thing that he could buy, and I sold him my olam haba. Isn't that funny? Then he notices his wife is not laughing. And he says, what's the matter? Don't you get the joke? She says, I'm not going to live with a man who sold his olam haba. Get it back. So he says, it was a joke. It was just a joke. She says, get it back. So he goes back to the tavern. The simple Jew is still there. And he says, listen, there was a mistake. It was a stupid thing. I'll give you back the ruble. Give me back the document. I'll rip it up. So the chassid said, I'm sorry. My Rebbe said I should buy, not sell. He told me to buy the first thing that I'm offering. He says, I'll give you 2 rubles. I'll give you double. Says, the Rebbe said to buy, not to sell. What can I do? He says, I'll give you 5 rubles. Nope. So the guy goes back to his wife and he says, the guy gave me a ruble. I'm offering him 5 rubles, 10 rubles. What do you want me to do? She said, get it back. So he goes back, and whatever it is, the chassid says, I was only authorized to buy, not to sell. And the person went up like to 1,000 rubles. He went to his Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, yeah, for 1,000 rubles you could sell it. And that gave him enough money to marry off his daughters and everything else. So the guy that paid 1,000 rubles to get back his Olam Haba went to the Rebbe. And he said, what type of yashrus is this? What type of honesty is this? I took 1 ruble, I gave him Olam Haba, and now he gets 1,000 rubles to give me back what belongs to me? So the Rebbe said, when you were willing to sell your Olam Haba for 1 ruble, it wasn't even worth that. And when you're willing to buy it back for 1,000 rubles, it's worth a lot more. You got a bargain. In other words, the concept is, your connection to spirituality depends on how much you value it. When you value it, it is worth infinitely great. When you don't care about it, it's worth nothing. So Yaakov didn't cheat Esav. To Esav, this birthright was worth nothing. Because if Esav is willing to give it up for a pot of beans, then that's what it's worth. It's worth a pot of beans. Yaakov didn't cheat him. But for Yaakov, it was a big deal. Okay, that's Act 1. But then we have Act 2, which is many, many years later, when Yitzhak is on his deathbed. Actually, Yitzhak didn't die then, but Yitzhak thinks he's on his deathbed. Yitzhak is 163 at this point. Remember that Yitzhak lives until 180. So we have one of the strangest, difficult incidences in the Torah where Yitzhak wants to give his blessing to Esav. And Rivka knows that that's not a good thing. But she can't talk to her husband about it. So instead, she goes through a whole strategy where Yaakov impersonates Esav. And Yitzchak gives the blessings to Yaakov, thinking he's giving the blessings to Esav. And then when Esav finally shows up, Yitzchak says, sorry, too late. And, Esav is understandably a little upset about this. And there are so many questions. Let me go over three basic questions about this. Question 1 is on Yitzchak. Why would Yitzchak favor Esav over Yaakov? Did Yitzchak think that Esav was more righteous than Yaakov? Was Esav Yitzchak's favorite son? Now, some commentaries do learn that Yitzchak actually was fooled by some of Esav's behavior, because Esav used to ask, number one, Esav was meticulous in honoring his father. Number 2, Esav used to ask kind of very frum halachic questions. He would say, for example, what tithes do you give from water and salt? Now, of course, there is no tithing from water and salt. So some actually say that Yitzchak was fooled by Esav into thinking that Esav was righteous. Right? And indeed, someone will learn, it says that Yitzchak was blinded, right? Yitzchak was blind, he couldn't see. And Rashi brings a medrash, he was blinded by the tears that the angels shed at the Akedah. So homiletically, some understand this, that Yitzchak was so connected to the highest realms of Kedusha that he could not understand hypocrisy, duplicity, and dishonesty. So if somebody comes across as righteous, Yitzchak gets fooled. Rivka, on the other hand, who comes from a family of liars and cheaters, she does understand duplicity. So that's pshat number 1, that many Meforshim learn. Yitzchak was simply fooled into thinking that Esav was a more righteous person than he was. But I would suggest that there are a number of kashas about this. In other words, I can give you some textual proof that Yitzchak certainly knew that Yaakov was a bigger tzaddik than Esav. First of all, you'll recall that right before the incident of the brachos, it mentions that Esav married a daughter of Yishmael, and Esav married a Canaanite woman. And it says explicitly this was a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. So Yitzchak is aware that Esav is violating the family tradition of marrying within the family of Avroham and not marrying Canaanite women. So he knew Esav was doing things that were not correct. The second indicator is that when Yaakov impersonates Esav, and Yaakov uses the name of God, so if you remember what Yitzchak says, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, and the hands are the hands of Esav, meaning the goat skins that are hairy. Well, Rashi explains when it says the voice is the voice of Yaakov, that is not referring to the physical voice. Yaakov and Esav were twins, their voices were identical. But he says, you sound like Yaakov because you're using the name of Hashem. And Esav never uses the name of Hashem. So those are two proofs that Yitzchak knows Esav is not such a righteous person. Number one, Esav married a Canaanite. And number two, Yitzchak knows that Esav never uses the name of Hashem. So as a result, it is clear that Yitzchak understands that Yaakov is the better person. So if that's the case, why would Yitzchak want to give the brachos to Esav? Right? Why would he want to give the brachos to Esav? So I want to share with you a very interesting explanation of the Malbim. We know that later in Jewish history, after Yaakov has the tribes, we know that two tribes were Yisachar and Zevulun. Yisachar was a tribe that was totally devoted to the learning of Torah. And Yisachar, and Zevulun was a tribe that was devoted to commerce and business. And Zevulun used its resources to enable Yisachar to learn Torah. And what do Chazal say? In the partnership between Yisachar and Zevulun, Zevulun gets equal credit with Yisachar. Because without Zevulun, Yisachar would not have been able to learn Torah. In fact, even today, people enter into partnerships sometimes. In fact, Moshe Feinstein says it has to be a real partnership agreement in which I would agree to support a person full-time in their learning as a Zevulun to their Yisachar. See, if you stam give charity to a yeshiva, so that's a mitzvah of charity. But Yisachar Zevulun has to be a real partnership in which you contribute the capital and they contribute the labor, so to speak. And that creates the partnership. Now, let me add that even Zevuluns are supposed to learn. It's not like you can get exempt from learning Torah by paying money. But this is the specialty. So here's the thing. Yitzchak looks at his son Esav. And he sees Esav doesn't learn. Esav is not a studier. Maybe Esav has ADD. He doesn't have Sitzfleisch. He's not in a beis medrash. But I love him. He is my son. I don't understand him. Only Avroham understood him. But I love him. What can I do to give him a connection to God? And then I look at my son Yaakov. My son Yaakov loves to learn. He's in the beis medrash. Now, if you look at the blessing, this is very important. If you look at the blessing that Yitzchak gave Yaakov when he thought he was giving the blessing to Esav, it is a blessing totally about material prosperity. May God give you dew and rain and crops and political leadership. This is what Yitzchak envisioned. Yitzchak envisioned that the relationship of Yaakov and Esav will be the relationship that later became Yisachar and Zevulun. I will give Esav the blessings of this world. I will give Esav prosperity. I will give him wealth. I will give him Eretz Yisrael. I will give him political domination. Because Esav is an activist. You can't sit Esav down in the beis medrash. Esav is a man of the field, a man of action. Men of action are important in the world. They build cities. They build economies. They invent. They have factories. right? Esav will be the man of action. And he will use his resources to enable the Yaakovs of the world to live godly lives. And therefore, Yitzchak wanted to give the blessings of Olam Hazeh to Esav in the hope and in the belief that Esav would use his resources to help Yaakov. And Yitzchak feels this is good for Esav and it's good for Yaakov. It's good for Esav because it allows Esav to use his energy and his talents in the ways that he's naturally gifted in, but to use them for good causes. And it's also good for Yaakov because Yaakov is freed of the burden of creating a society, building cities, digging ditches, planting fields, political intrigue, military conquest. Let Yaakov forget about all that. Let the Esavs of the world handle the physical and political and material building of society. And let the Yaakovs of the world be the spiritual leaders that will give us the insight and the inspiration. And therefore, it's not that Yitzchak thought Esav was a bigger tzaddik than Yaakov. It's the other way around. He thought this would precisely be Esav's redemption. Now, what's interesting and tragic is that Yitzchak is trying to make up for a mistake that was made many, many years before. Now, this is a thought from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Sometimes when I say it, I am severely criticized because it seems to be a critique of Yitzchak and Rivka's parenting styles. So I have to say, this is what Rav Hirsch says. I mean, it's not for us to judge the Avos. It says that when Yaakov and Esav were born, and Yaakov was smooth and Esav was hairy, so the pasuk says, "Vayigdelu hana'arim." The youths grew up, and Esav became a man of the field who was a hunter, and Yaakov dwelt in the tents. Rav Hirsch says the critical wrong turn in their upbringing was Vayigdelu hana'arim. They were raised in the same way. Yaakov and Esav had different personalities. Yaakov and Esav had different talents. But initially, Yitzchak and Rivka's agenda was to raise both of them by putting them in the Beis HaMedrash, whatever that meant then, making them learn all day. And Rav Hirsch says that wasn't what Esav needed. And if you try to make an Esav into a Yaakov, not only will you not get a Yaakov out of it, but you will not get the Esav that you could have gotten. What can I tell you? The truth of the matter is we actually see the consequences of this every single day in countless homes. And it's a very, very sad thing in which we're not always responsive to the individuality of the child's personality, to the child's talents, to the child's interests. And we try to superimpose a framework. Talk about, square peg in a round hole or whatever it would be. That will be destructive to the child. And what happens is that not only does the child not flourish in the way that you're trying to impose on him, but he doesn't become self-actualized in the way that he could have become self-actualized had we been more sensitive. This is what Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, Proverbs, Chanoch l'nar al pi darko. Educate a child according to their way. Their way. Everyone has their way. And we got to try to find what that way is. Not that I understand this, but artists sometimes say, sculptors sometimes say, that when they look at a piece of wood or a piece of stone, they don't really form the statue. They just remove the impediments so that which is already imminent in the wood comes out. Again, I can't say, not being an artist, I cannot say I fully understand what that even means. But that's what they say. They say, we don't make the statue. We remove the impediment so the statue that is there comes out. You know, that's what raising a child actually is. Raising a child is to try to remove the blockages that enable the personality and nature of the child to emerge in a good and healthy way. Chanoch lenar al pi darko. Rav Hirsch says the same way that parents, especially when they have twins, they sometimes dress them the same. So Yitzhak and Rivka were training Yaakov and Esav in the same way. That was destructive. That made Esav a rebel. So now what's fascinating is, so many years later, Yitzhak is trying to correct the mistake that was made when they were children. Yitzhak is now saying, Esav is different. He needs different things. Esav is not going to be the one who sits in the Beis HaMedrash. But Esav can be the one with energy, the one with drive, the one with creativity, the one that will build cities and create governments and devise plans. Because he can't be confined in that Beis Medrash way. But he will use his resources for Yaakov. That frees up Yaakov, and that gives Esav the ability to do everything that he's able to do. In other words, it is a tikkun, it is a rectification to Vayigdalu Hana'arim. Vayigdalu Hana'arim was a parental failure. And now Yitzchak wants to rectify it. So, sounds good. So what's Rivka's problem? Rivka understands. Too little, too late. Maybe this would have worked. And again, you see, it's a tragedy. Maybe this would have worked at an earlier stage in life. But Esav's path is already set. If Esav gets the brachot, he is not going to use it for the benefit of Yaakov. He will use it to destroy Yaakov. He will use it to get rid of the spiritual message that Yaakov represents. Yitzchak has a utopian vision that is ultimately a bit naive. Yitzchak's vision is, give Esav all of the prosperity of Olam Hazeh, and he will devote his resources to enhancing the spirituality of Yaakov. Rivka is the realist here. Rivka says, that utopian vision ain't going to happen. Now, question number 2, though, is, why couldn't Rivka tell Yitzchak that? I mean, so here you have a communication issue, and this goes back to the Netziv that says, Sarah tells Avroham, we got a problem with Yishmael. But somehow, Rivka cannot tell Yitzchak, we have a problem with Esav. And the Netziv says, indeed, the Netziv says the point I made earlier, that Rivka was in awe of Yitzchak. And really, she needed to shock Yitzchak into understanding. Because again, the way the Mefarshim understand it, although when Yitzchak gave the blessings, he thought he was talking to Esav. But by the end of the story, when Esav showed up, and Yitzchak realized he was deceived, he said the words, these are critical words, Gam Baruch Yihiyeh. He who got the blessings will be blessed. Now this is very important. The Medrash makes the point that Yitzchak understood by this shocking revelation that Yaakov deserved the brachas. So it is important to know that this was not a bracha based on fraud, because Yitzchak ultimately validated the bracha itself. But again, there are so many peculiarities here, and that is, Yaakov is described in our tradition as the man of truth. Avroham is chesed, loving kindness. Yitzchak is inner strength. And Yaakov is called emes. This is a pasuk in Micha. Titein emet liYaakov. Ascribe truth to Yaakov. Now Yaakov could be righteous. You can call Yaakov a million things. Is Yaakov the man of truth? I mean, think about the number of apparent deceptions or trickeries that Yaakov engages in. Okay, buying the birthright might be trickery, although you could look at that differently, but getting the blessings are certainly trickery, because he masquerades as Esau, albeit, now again, we have to give Yaakov credit. He didn't want to do it, right? He told his mother, what if my father discovers this and he'll curse me, etc.? And Rivka said, I'll take the curse. Okay, so we could say that Yaakov was a reluctant participant. But Lamaisa, he is the one that said, when Yitzhak said, who are you? And he says, I am Esau, your firstborn. Now, of course, Chazal say there's verbal manipulation. The way he said it was, I am I. And then, Esau is your firstborn. Oh, okay, those are tricks. But obviously, whatever Yaakov technically said, that he didn't utter a lie. But he clearly, deceived his father. And then, of course, later with Lavan, we also have other things where Yaakov pulls different shtick with the sheep. Okay, so Yaakov is a man of truth. And yet Yaakov gets the brachos through deception. In other words, that's a very, very strange idea. And here, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky offers an interesting insight. Rav Kamenetsky says that the nature of God giving you a trial is to sometimes act against your nature to understand that sometimes even things that are totally abhorrent to you need to be done for higher good. Now, this is a very dangerous idea because this suggests ends justify the means, but the truth of the matter is, it is true that the ends do not always justify the means. But it's also true that sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. In other words, to make this statement that moral people like to say, the ends never justify the means, is actually not true. I mean, let me give you a very simple example. Let's imagine that you're a person who never lies. You believe that truth is extremely important, which it is. And there's a terrorist who comes in with a machine gun and says, where's that 5th grade class? So are you supposed to tell them, oh, turn right, first classroom to the right? There are times in which you lie. Say, oh, they're in the baseball field out there, whatever works. Now that's an extreme case, but that does illustrate that to make an absolute statement that the ends never justify the means is an untrue statement. As bad as it is to lie. And again, I mean, the Torah takes lying very, very seriously. So, by Avroham Avinu, whose natural tendency is loving kindness, what was the greatest nisayon in his life? To sacrifice his son Yitzhak. To show that even if it's an act of cruelty, he's willing to do it. For Yitzhak, it's not such a sacrifice, because Yitzhak lives with inner strength. So Yitzhak could give his life for God. But Avram couldn't it would be very hard for Avram to take it. So the same way that Avram is given a nisayon that goes beyond his comfort zone, Yaakov has to be willing to lie for this higher purpose. Because Yaakov is naturally the man of truth, but the idea of nisayon is to go beyond your nature. Meaning to say, to understand that sometimes lying becomes necessary. Now again, this is a dangerous idea because it can obviously be distorted, it can obviously be abused, but nonetheless the Torah needs to establish that as important as truth is, the man of truth must be willing to sometimes depart for truth when there's a fundamentally important purpose to ensure the survival of the creation and the survival of the Jewish people. But Rav Hirsch adds a certain twist. Rav Hirsch says, this is quite amazing, that Yaakov is not such a great liar here. Number one, Yaakov continues to use the name of Hashem so that Yitzhak says, the voice is the voice of Yaakov. So Rav Hirsch actually says, this is a chiddush, this is not the Pashat Pshat, that Yaakov lied, but he lied in such a way that Yitzchak would actually realize that Yaakov is standing in front of him in line. He actually says Yitzchak knew at some point he was talking to Yaakov. So what's the point of Yaakov engaging in deception? Because the following. Part of Yitzchak's reason that he didn't want to give the blessings to Yaakov is he thought that for Yaakov to be involved in a political world, in a military world, in a Gashmi world, would destroy Yaakov. They would eat him alive. Yaakov doesn't know how to deal with cheaters and deceivers. And therefore I want him to live in a cloistered life. And let Esav deal with all of the liars of the world. So Yaakov needs to show Yitzchak, I know how to lie too. I know how to play the game. And because I know how to play the game, I'm not going to be destroyed by that game. And therefore you can give me the brachos. That's a very different understanding. It's not that Yaakov is actually deceiving Esav, but Yaakov is symbolically deceiving Yitzchak, but Yaakov is symbolically communicating, I know how to play this game, therefore they're not going to destroy me. Okay, so it's a very, very complicated dynamic, but the final point I want to raise is that there was I think she's still alive, the professor of Harvard, the president of Harvard University for many years was a fellow Derek Bach. I think he's not alive anymore. His wife was a professor at Harvard herself. Her name was Sissela Bach, not non-Jewish, but Sissela Bach is a moral philosopher. So she writes about morality and philosophy, and her specialty is the ethics of lying and truth-telling. So she's written a number of books on when is it moral to lie, when is it not moral to lie. And she develops a very fascinating idea. I don't think she was the first one, but she developed an idea called a moral trace. That means the following, that even when something is justified, even when a bad action is morally justified, the fact that it's a bad action leaves a certain taint in your character. And this is very important. An example would be, look at the physical world. If I'm walking by a fire in a building, and there's a baby, and I jump into the building and I rescue the baby, did I do a moral thing? Yeah. Did I do a heroic action? Yes. But just because it was a good thing doesn't mean I'm not going to be burnt, because it's almost an inevitable consequence that you're going to get burnt, and the morality or the correctness of what you did is not going to protect you from the burning. So Dr. Bach explains that the same thing is true when you have a justification for immoral acts. Even when you have a green light to lie, it leaves a trace, it leaves a pagam in your character. Meaning, just because you were justified in doing it doesn't mean it doesn't affect you in negative ways. And here's what the Medrash says. Did Yaakov have the right to engage in deception? Our assumption is yes, he deserved the brachot. Esav, Yitzchak's calculation of Yisachar and Zevulun wasn't going to work. So did Yaakov sin by what he did? Our assumption is no. And the proof is that Yitzchak validated the brachot by saying, Gam Barechi. But let's see what happened to Yaakov as a result of his lying. As a result of Yaakov's deception, he flees Eretz Yisrael and spends 20 years in Lavan's house. And what is Yaakov a victim of in Lavan's house over and over? He works 7 years to marry Rachel. And he's victimized by a substitution of Leah, which makes him work another 7 years. And then with the sheep, Lavan keeps on changing the payment arrangements. In other words, Yaakov lies to get the brachos, and Yaakov becomes a victim of the lies of Lavan. And even more tragically, Yaakov is later the victim of the lies of his own children, who sold Yosef into slavery and convinced him that Yosef was dead. The saying goes, I always forget, is it what goes around comes around, or what comes around goes around? I always forget which way it goes. But whichever way it goes, he who engages in lies, in fraud, in deception, in misrepresentation, is going to suffer from the very negative forces that they released. Was Yaakov justified? Yeah. But just because it was justified doesn't mean it doesn't have a cost. And in fact, the blessings were not even Mekayim. The Medrash actually says that the blessings that Yaakov did receive were never fully fulfilled, and they will not be fulfilled until Mashiach comes. Okay, so this is a very, very confusing, ambiguous lesson. I wish I could be more definitive about this. Because on one hand, the lesson is sometimes you have to lie. And sometimes the ends justify the means. And you got to do what you have to do. Because so much is at stake that you need to take extreme measures. But then you have a counter message. But don't think you're not going to suffer because of it. There are going to be costs to engaging in immoral means, even when they're necessary. It's a hard parsha in many, many ways. This is, I was telling my wife that I thought this story of Yaakov and Esav is really one of the most difficult stories, together with the sale of Yosef, which was coming down the pipe. Some of the most difficult stories to understand. Because in some ways I consider this to be more difficult than the sale. I mean, the sale of Yosef is simply, how could brothers do it? Okay, that's a good question. But this is more difficult to me because this means that the very foundation of the Jewish nation, which is based on getting those blessings from Yitzhak, was based on this type of fraud or deception. I mean that goes to the creation of Am Yisrael. So that's a real difficulty. And as I say, part of the answer is sometimes extreme means are necessary for extremely important causes, but they do have a cost. Don't think you get away with it. It'll come back and bite you in various ways. So, something to think about, and I wish everyone a good Shabbos, and be well.